In the shadowed heart of 16th century Hungary, within the cold stone walls of Szeged Castle, a noblewoman's name became synonymous with unspeakable horror. Elizabeth Bathory, a countess of immense wealth and power, presided over a domain where whispers of cruelty grew into screams that echoed through the Carpathian Mountains. Her castle, perched like a predator on a hill, was not just a fortress of stone but a prison of despair, where young women vanished into the night, never to return. This is not a tale of mere legend, but a chilling chronicle of real crimes, of a woman whose thirst for beauty and control birthed a legacy of blood. Born in 1560 into the prestigious Bathory family, Elizabeth was a product of her time, a time when nobility wielded unchecked power over the lives of peasants, and the line between justice and tyranny was perilously thin. Her early years were marked by privilege, education, and a marriage at 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a warrior nobleman whose frequent absences left Elizabeth to govern their vast estates alone. Yet, beneath her refined exterior, something darker simmered. The cultural backdrop of the era, steeped in superstition and the brutal realities of feudal life, provided fertile ground for her obsessions to take root. Tales of witchcraft and the occult were rampant, and the belief in blood as a source of vitality was not uncommon among the elite. Elizabeth's world was one of opulence and violence, where the powerful could indulge their darkest whims without consequence, or so she thought. As the years passed, her beauty, once celebrated across Hungary, began to fade, and with it her patience for the natural order of time. Whispers began to spread among the villagers below Szeged Castle, tales of servant girls lured to the castle with promises of work, only to disappear without a trace. The local clergy and minor nobles, though uneasy, turned a blind eye, for who would dare challenge a Bathory, a family intertwined with the very fabric of Hungarian power? Yet, the cries of the missing could not be silenced forever. The tension grew as more families mourned their daughters, and rumors of torture and murder began to seep beyond the castle walls. What drove a woman of such stature to descend into depravity? Was it vanity, madness, or something far more sinister embedded in her soul? The stage was set for a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. Elizabeth's castle became a labyrinth of terror, its chambers hiding secrets too horrific to speak aloud. Historical accounts, pieced together from testimonies and later investigations, paint a picture of a woman who saw herself as untouchable, a goddess above mortal laws. Her victims, often young peasant girls between the ages of 10 and 14, were chosen for their innocence and vitality qualities Elizabeth believed she could steal through rituals as grotesque as they were delusional. The cultural fascination with youth and beauty, combined with her unchecked authority, created a perfect storm. She surrounded herself with loyal accomplices, servants who became instruments of her cruelty, ensuring her dark desires were met without question. This descent into darkness did not happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling fueled by a society that revered nobility to the point of blindness. The political landscape of Hungary, fractured by wars with the Ottoman Empire and internal strife, left little room for oversight of her remote castle's affairs. Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc, known as the Black Hero of Hungary for his military prowess, was often away, leaving her to rule as she saw fit. Her early acts of cruelty, perhaps dismissed as mere discipline by those around her, escalated into something far more monstrous. By the time the first whispers of her crimes reached the ears of distant authorities, countless lives had already been snuffed out in the name of her vanity. The story of Elizabeth Bathory is not just a recounting of historical events. It is a descent into the abyss of human cruelty, a reminder of what happens when power knows no bounds. As we peel back the layers of her life, we uncover not only the horrors she inflicted but the societal failures that allowed them to flourish. Her castle, once a symbol of noble strength, became a tomb for the innocent, its walls stained with the blood of those who could not fight back. What drove her to such extremes? How did a woman of privilege become a monster in the eyes of history? These questions linger as we step deeper into her world, a world where beauty was a curse and blood was the price of immortality. This is the beginning of a tale that will unravel the real crimes of Elizabeth Bathory, a woman whose name would echo through centuries as the Blood Countess. Her story is one of tragedy, terror, and the darkest corners of the human psyche. As we move forward, we will explore the roots of her power, the escalation of her atrocities, and the eventual reckoning that sought to bring justice to the tortured souls of Seagate Castle. But for now, the stage is set, and the shadows of her castle loom large, waiting to reveal their secrets. Elizabeth Bathory was born into a world where bloodlines dictated destiny, and hers was among the most illustrious in Hungary. In 1560, she entered the powerful Bathory family, a dynasty with deep ties to royalty and a reputation for both brilliance and brutality. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, would later become King of Poland, while her relatives held sway over vast swathes of Eastern Europe. Raised in the family estate of near Bator, Elizabeth's early life was one of opulence, surrounded by tutors who taught her Latin, German, and Greek, an education rare for women of her time. Yet, this privilege came with a shadow. The Bathorys were known for their ruthless defense of power, and whispers of inbreeding and mental instability haunted their lineage. Some historians suggest Elizabeth may have witnessed or experienced cruelty in her formative years, planting seeds of darkness in a mind already shaped by entitlement. At the tender age of 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a nobleman 10 years her senior, in a union that solidified alliances and expanded their combined wealth. Ferenc, often called the Black Hero of Hungary for his ferocity against the Ottoman Turks, was a man of war, frequently absent from home as he fought on distant battlefields. Their marriage, while politically advantageous, left Elizabeth to manage their sprawling estates, including the foreboding Seagate Castle in what is now Slovakia. This isolation, coupled with her husband's prolonged absences, gave her near absolute control over the lives of those within her domain. The castle, a grim fortress perched atop a hill, became her kingdom, its remote location shielding her actions from prying eyes. In an era when feudal lords and ladies were seen as near-divine figures by the peasantry, Elizabeth's authority was unquestioned, her whim's law. The cultural and political context of late 16th century Hungary further enabled her unchecked power. The region was a battleground, torn between the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and internal noble factions vying for dominance. This chaos meant that the central authority of the Hungarian crown was often weak, especially in remote areas like Seagate. The peasantry, already burdened by war, famine, and disease, had little recourse against the abuses of the nobility. Superstition ran rampant, with beliefs in witchcraft and the supernatural permeating all levels of society. Blood, in particular, held a mystical, alluresome alchemical texts of the time claimed it could restore youth or grant vitality. While there's no direct evidence Elizabeth read such works, her later actions suggest an obsession with these ideas, perhaps fueled by the era's fascination with the occult and her own growing paranoia about aging. Elizabeth's early years as a countess were not immediately marked by the horrors that would define her legacy. She bore 4 children, though her role as a mother seemed secondary to her duties as a ruler of her estates. Historical records indicate she was initially seen as a capable, if stern, noblewoman, managing finances and overseeing the welfare of her lands with a firm hand. Yet, beneath this facade, tensions simmered. Her temper was notorious, and accounts from servants suggest she was quick to punish perceived slights with physical violence. These early acts of cruelty, slapping servants or ordering harsh beatings, were not uncommon among the nobility, often dismissed as discipline. But for Elizabeth, they were a gateway to something far darker. As her beauty began to wane in her late 20s and early 30s, so too did her restraint, and her punishments grew more severe, more personal. The dynamics within Seagate Castle created a perfect storm for her descent. Elizabeth surrounded herself with a small circle of loyal accomplice servants and confidants who would later be implicated in her crimes. Figures like Anna Darvulia, a woman rumored to have knowledge of witchcraft, and Dorothea Sentes, a brutal enforcer, became extensions of her will. These individuals, often from lower social strata, were bound to her by fear, loyalty, or the promise of reward. They helped procure young girls from nearby villages, luring them with offers of work as maids or attendants, only to deliver them into a nightmare. The power imbalance was stark. A noblewoman of Elizabeth's stature could command obedience without question, and in a society where peasants were seen as little more than property, their disappearances raised few alarms among those who mattered. As the years progressed, the first cracks in the facade of normalcy began to appear. Villagers whispered of girls who entered the castle and never returned, of strange cries heard in the night, and of bloodstains glimpsed by those few who dared approach the fortress. Yet, fear of retribution kept most silent. The local clergy, dependent on noble patronage, hesitated to act, while minor officials lacked the authority to challenge a Bathory. Elizabeth's status as a widow after Ferenc's death in 1604 only amplified her autonomy, removing even the nominal oversight of a husband. Now, with no one to temper her impulses, her obsessions took full hold. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would stain the pages of history, as Szeged Castle transformed from a noble seat into a chamber of horrors. This period of Elizabeth's life reveals the dangerous intersection of power, isolation, and societal neglect. Her privilege shielded her, her castle hid her, and the turmoil of her time ignored her. But the whispers could not be contained forever. As more families mourned their daughters, the tension in the surrounding villages grew, a quiet undercurrent of dread that would soon swell into something undeniable. The Blood Countess, as she would come to be known, stood on the precipice of infamy, her crimes poised to escalate beyond imagination. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth Bathory stood at the height of her power, a widow ruling over Szeged Castle with an iron grip, her authority unchallenged in the remote reaches of Hungary. Yet, beneath the surface of her noble facade, a storm of obsession brewed, fueled by vanity and a growing fear of mortality. As her once celebrated beauty faded with age, Elizabeth became consumed by a desperate need to reclaim her youth, a need that twisted into something monstrous. Historical accounts suggest that around this time, after the death of her husband Ferenc Nadezhdy in 1604, her behavior shifted dramatically. No longer bound by even the nominal presence of a spouse, she turned inward, her mind fixating on myths and superstitions that promised eternal vitality through the most horrific means. The conflict within Elizabeth was mirrored by the growing unease outside her castle walls. Villagers in the surrounding areas of Szeged began to notice a chilling pattern. Young women, often their daughters or sisters, would be summoned to the castle under the guise of employment, only to vanish without a trace. These were not noblewomen or even merchants' kin, but peasant girls, aged between 10 and 14, whose disappearances carried little weight in a society that valued them as little more than labor. Yet, as the numbers grew dozens, then scores, the whispers turned to murmurs of dread. Parents forbade their daughters from approaching the castle, but poverty often left them no choice. The promise of wages or a better life was a lure too strong to resist, even as rumors of torture and death began to circulate. Elizabeth's accomplices, including the sinister Anna Darvulia and the brutal Dorothea Sentes, scoured the countryside, preying on the vulnerable with cold efficiency. Inside the castle, Elizabeth's obsession with beauty and blood took on a ritualistic fervor. Historical testimonies from later investigations reveal that she believed the blood of young virgins held the key to rejuvenation, a belief possibly inspired by the era's alchemical and occult practices. What began as harsh punishments for perceived slight slapping or beating servants escalated into deliberate acts of cruelty designed to extract this supposed elixir of youth. She surrounded herself with a cabal of loyal enablers who not only facilitated her desires but encouraged them, feeding her delusions with tales of witchcraft and dark magic. The castle's isolation became her shield. Its thick walls muffled the screams, and its remote location deterred interference. The tension within her household was palpable, as even her most trusted servants lived in fear of becoming the next target of her wrath. The societal dynamics of the time only deepened the conflict. Hungary's fractured political landscape, with its ongoing wars against the Ottomans and internal noble rivalries, meant that the crown's attention was elsewhere. Local authorities, often beholden to powerful families like the Bathorys, were reluctant to investigate rumors of misconduct, especially against a woman of Elizabeth's stature. Her family's influence loomed large. Her relatives held high positions in the kingdom, and her wealth ensured loyalty from those who might otherwise speak out. Even the church, a potential moral counterweight, hesitated. Priests in the region were dependent on noble patronage, and while some expressed concern over the growing number of missing girls, their complaints rarely reached higher ears. This inaction created a void where Elizabeth's depravity could flourish unchecked, her castle a black hole swallowing the innocent. As the body count rose, so did the audacity of her actions. Elizabeth began to target not just peasants but the daughters of minor gentry, a move that would later prove her undoing. These families, though not as powerful as the Bathorys, had enough standing to voice their grievances, and their complaints added to the growing chorus of suspicion. Meanwhile, inside Sete, the atmosphere grew ever darker. Servants who dared to resist or flee were met with brutal retribution, their fates serving as warnings to others. The castle became a prison not just for her victims, but for anyone under her control, a place where loyalty was enforced through terror. Elizabeth's paranoia intensified alongside her cruelty. She feared betrayal from within and discovery from without, yet her compulsion to continue her gruesome rituals overpowered any sense of caution. The tension reached a boiling point as rumors spread beyond the local villages, carried by travelers and merchants to larger towns. Tales of the Blood Countess began to take shape, a moniker born from hushed conversations about blood-drenched chambers and ghostly cries echoing from the castle at night. While Elizabeth remained untouchable for now, the seeds of her downfall were being sown. Each missing girl, each whispered story, added weight to a growing wave of outrage that even her noble status could not indefinitely suppress. Her obsession had transformed her from a stern noblewoman into a predator, her castle a hunting ground where innocence was the ultimate prey. This escalating conflict marked a turning point in Elizabeth Bathory's story. Her actions, once hidden by isolation and privilege, were beginning to pierce the veil of secrecy. The suffering of her victims, though silenced in life, was starting to speak through the collective grief of their families. As we move deeper into this tale, the true extent of her horrors will come to light, revealing a darkness that would stain history forever. Within the cold, unyielding walls of Sejte Castle, Elizabeth Bathory's descent into depravity reached its most horrifying depths. By the late 1600s, her obsession with youth and beauty had transformed her fortress into a tomb for the innocent, a place where young girls faced unimaginable suffering. Historical records, drawn from later testimonies of survivors and accomplices, reveal a systematic campaign of torture that was as methodical as it was monstrous. Elizabeth, now in her 40s, saw each victim not as a person but as a vessel for her twisted rituals, their blood, a supposed elixir to defy time itself. The castle's dungeons and hidden chambers became the stage for her atrocities, their stone walls bearing silent witness to cries that no one outside could hear. The victims, primarily peasant girls lured by promises of work or better lives, entered Sejte with hope, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. Once inside, they were stripped of freedom, often locked in cramped, freezing cells or chained in the castle's lower levels. Elizabeth, aided by her loyal circle of enablers figures like Doracha Countess, Ilona Jo, and the shadowy Anna Darvuli, ensured that escape was impossible. These accomplices, hardened by years of complicity, acted as jailers and torturers, carrying out their mistress's orders with chilling precision. The girls, some as young as 10, were subjected to a litany of abuses designed to break their bodies and spirits. Historical accounts describe how Elizabeth would order them beaten with whips or clubs, their skin torn open as punishment for the slightest perceived offense, or simply for her own amusement. The torture escalated beyond mere beatings into realms of grotesque cruelty. Testimonies from the eventual trials paint a harrowing picture. Girls were burned with hot irons, their flesh seared as Elizabeth watched with cold fascination. Some were forced to endure mutilation, their fingers or limbs cut or torn as part of her sadistic experiments. One of the most infamous claims, though debated by historians, is that she bathed in the blood of her victims, believing it would restore her youth. While direct evidence of blood baths is scarce, the sheer volume of blood spilled in her presence is undeniable. Girls were often bled through cuts or wounds, their life essence collected in basins or smeared on Elizabeth's skin in a macabre ritual. The castle's chambers reeked of iron and decay, a testament to the scale of her violence. The emotional toll on the victims was as devastating as the physical. These young women, torn from their families, lived in constant terror, knowing that each day could be their last. Some were forced to witness the suffering of others, a psychological torment meant to crush any hope of resistance. Elizabeth's wrath was unpredictable. A girl might be spared one day only to face unimaginable pain the next, her fate dictated by the Countess's whims. The isolation of Sejdeh amplified their despair. Miles from help, surrounded by loyal servants who saw them as disposable, they had no one to turn to. Their decline was not just physical but spiritual, their innocence stolen long before their lives were extinguished. Elizabeth herself showed no signs of remorse, her decline into madness or perhaps a calculated cruelty evident in her escalating brutality. As the years wore on, her paranoia grew. She feared betrayal from her own household and became obsessed with maintaining control through terror. Even her accomplices lived in fear of her temper, knowing that a misstep could turn them from enablers to victims. Yet her compulsion to continue her rituals overpowered any sense of caution. The castle became a self-contained hell, its inhabitants bound by a shared descent into darkness. Historical estimates suggest that over the course of her reign of terror, hundreds of girls, possibly as many as 650, though the exact number remains uncertain, met their end within those walls, their bodies discarded in shallow graves, hidden rooms, or even thrown to the elements. The suffering within Sejdeh Castle was a brutal truth, grounded in the accounts of those few who survived and the confessions of Elizabeth's accomplices during later investigations. It was a place where power corrupted absolutely, where a noblewoman's vanity became a death sentence for the powerless. The torture was not just an act of violence but a perverse expression of control, a way for Elizabeth to defy the natural order of aging by destroying the youth of others. As the body count rose, the castle's reputation as a place of evil solidified, its name whispered with dread by those who lived in its shadow. This chapter of Elizabeth Bathory's story reveals the depths of human cruelty, a darkness that flourished in the absence of accountability. The tortured souls of Sejdeh Castle, though silenced in life, would eventually speak through the outrage their deaths inspired. As we move forward, the climax of her reign of terror looms, a moment when even her noble status could no longer shield her from the consequences of her crimes. By 1610, Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror within Sejdeh Castle had reached its ghastly zenith, a crescendo of cruelty that stained the very stones of her fortress with blood. For over a decade, she had preyed on the innocent, her obsession with youth and beauty driving her to commit acts of unimaginable horror. The dungeons and hidden chambers of her castle bore witness to the final moments of countless young women, their lives extinguished in rituals of sadistic desperation. Historical records from the time, including testimonies gathered during subsequent investigations, suggest that her violence had become almost frenzied, as if she sensed the walls of her impunity beginning to crumble. This was the climax of her dark legacy, a moment when the sheer scale of her atrocities became impossible to conceal, even for a noblewoman of her stature. The graphic nature of her crimes during this period is chillingly documented in later accounts. Elizabeth, now in her 50s, had refined her methods of torture into a perverse art form, each act more depraved than the last. Girls were not merely beaten or bled. They were subjected to prolonged agonies designed to maximize suffering. Some were hung by their wrists from the ceiling, their bodies slashed to drain their blood into basins below while Elizabeth watched, her face a mask of cold fascination. Others were forced into freezing baths or exposed to the bitter Carpathian winter, their skin turning blue as they succumbed to hypothermia under her orders. One particularly harrowing account describes a girl sewn into the belly of a dead horse, left to die in agony as a punishment for attempting escape. These acts were not just about blood or beauty anymore. They were a display of absolute power, a defiance of humanity itself. The emotional peak of this horror was felt not just by her victims but by the few within her household who still clung to some shred of conscience. Even her most loyal accomplices, Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Joe, and others began to falter under the weight of their complicity, though fear kept them silent. Elizabeth's paranoia had grown alongside her cruelty. She trusted no one, lashing out at the slightest hint of disobedience. The castle, once a symbol of noble strength, had become a suffocating prison for all within it, a place where death was the only escape. The air was thick with dread, the scent of blood and decay a constant reminder of the lives snuffed out. Each scream that echoed through the halls was a testament to her unchecked madness, a sound that could no longer be contained by stone or distance. Yet, this climax of cruelty was also the tipping point. Elizabeth's audacity had overreached, as she began targeting not just peasant girls but the daughters of minor nobility, a fatal misstep in a society where class lines were sacrosanct. These families, unlike the powerless villagers, had the means and connections to raise alarms. Complaints began to reach higher authorities, including György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a powerful figure tasked with maintaining order in the kingdom. Rumors of the Blood Countess had spread far beyond Székely, carried by travelers and merchants to the courts of Vienna and beyond. The sheer number of missing girls, estimated in the hundreds by some accounts, could no longer be dismissed as mere gossip. Even Elizabeth's family ties, once a shield, began to weaken as her actions threatened to tarnish the Bathory name itself. The breaking point came in late 1610, when Thurzo, under pressure from both noble families and the church, ordered an investigation. On the 30th of December, 1610, he arrived at Székely Castle with a contingent of soldiers determined to uncover the truth. What they found was a scene of unspeakable horror. Emaciated girls still alive but bearing the marks of torture, hidden rooms filled with blood-stained instruments, and evidence of hastily buried bodies in the castle grounds. Elizabeth was caught in the act, her denials futile against the overwhelming proof of her crimes. The discovery was a cinematic moment of reckoning, the noblewoman's facade of untouchability shattered as the weight of her atrocities was laid bare. Thurzo, a man hardened by war and politics, was reportedly shaken by the extent of the depravity, ordering her immediate arrest along with her accomplices. This was the tragic and unforgettable climax of Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror, a moment when the blood of her victims finally cried out loud enough to pierce the veil of privilege. The castle, once her impenetrable fortress, became her cage, its walls now witnesses to her downfall rather than her dominance. The emotional weight of this turning point resonates through history. A noblewoman who saw herself as a goddess brought low by the very humanity she sought to destroy. As the investigation unfolded, the full scope of her crimes would shock even the most jaded observers, setting the stage for a reckoning that would echo through the centuries. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory on the 30th of December, 1610, marked the end of a reign of terror that had consumed countless lives within the walls of Széchenyi Castle. György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and his men uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror-living victims bearing scars of torture, blood-stained chambers, and shallow graves scattered across the castle grounds. Elizabeth, once an untouchable noblewoman, was stripped of her autonomy, confined within her own fortress as the weight of her crimes came crashing down. Her accomplices, Dorottya Sentes, Ilona Joe, and others were also seized, their loyalty to the Countess no longer a shield against justice. The investigation that followed was swift and damning, with testimonies from survivors and confessions extracted under duress, painting a vivid picture of systematic cruelty. Over 300 witnesses came forward, their accounts estimating the number of victims between 80 and 650, though the exact toll remains a historical mystery. The legal proceedings against Elizabeth and her enablers were a spectacle in a society unaccustomed to holding the nobility accountable. Her accomplices faced brutal retribution. In early 1611, Dorottya and Ilona were convicted of murder and torture, their fingers torn out with hot pincers before they were burned to live a punishment, reflecting the savagery they had inflicted. Another servant, Fico, was beheaded and burned, while a lesser accomplice was spared execution but imprisoned for life. Elizabeth herself, however, escaped such a public fate. Her high status and family connections, including relatives who still wielded influence, ensured a different outcome. Rather than face trial or execution, she was sentenced to lifelong imprisonment within Széchenyi Castle, walled up in a small room with only slits for air and food. This was both a mercy and a torment. A noblewoman spared death but condemned to live out her days in the very place where she had spilled so much blood. She died there on the 21st of August, 1614, at the age of 54, her passing marked by no ceremony, only silence. The aftermath of her crimes rippled through Hungary and beyond, affecting the institutions and people tied to her legacy. The Bathory family, once a pillar of power, saw their reputation tarnished, though they retained influence through strategic silence and distance from Elizabeth's actions. Széchenyi Castle itself became a place of infamy, abandoned by many and whispered about as cursed, its walls a grim reminder of the horrors they had contained. The local peasantry, long silenced by fear, found some measure of closure, though the scars of lost daughters and sisters never fully healed. The case also prompted a rare moment of reflection among the nobility and the church, raising questions about the unchecked power of feudal lords and the moral failures that allowed such atrocities to persist. Yet, systemic change was slow. The feudal structure endured, and the plight of the powerless remained largely unchanged. Elizabeth Bathory's legacy in history is a complex and often sensationalized one. Dubbed the Blood Countess, she became a figure of both historical fact and Gothic myth, her story intertwined with tales of vampirism and bloodbaths that may exaggerate the already grim reality. Early accounts, written decades after her death, sometimes blurred the line between evidence and folklore, cementing her as one of history's most notorious female killers. Modern historians debate the extent of her guilt. Some suggest her crimes were inflated by political enemies or misogynistic biases against a powerful widow, while others argue the sheer volume of testimony confirms her monstrous acts. Regardless, her name endures as a symbol of aristocratic cruelty and the dark potential of unchecked privilege. In popular culture, she is often remembered through horror stories and films, a figure whose real crimes are sometimes overshadowed by the legend they inspired. The story of Elizabeth Bathory is not just a recounting of historical events, but a mirror held up to the failures of a society that allowed such darkness to flourish. What does it say about humanity that a woman of such stature could destroy so many lives before facing consequence? How many other horrors went unnoticed in an era where power was law? Her tale lingers as a cautionary reminder of the cost of silence, of the need to hear the cries of the voiceless before they are lost to history. As we close this chapter, the shadows of Seagate Castle remain, etched into the collective memory as a place where beauty became a curse and blood a currency of madness. If this story has stirred something in you, be it horror, curiosity, or a question about the nature of evil, share your thoughts. What do you think drove Elizabeth to such extremes? And what can we learn from the silence that enabled her?